Welcome back to the Garden Hosers. Today we're dealing with a problem, and that problem is I have seed potatoes ready to go, but it is June 26th. So is it too late? Should I just not plant potatoes this year? The answer is no! It's not too late. Let's just go over how to plant potatoes. So I have these seed potatoes in my hand, and if you look at them, you see them? They're not much to look at. They're tiny little things. They're like baby potatoes. So the first thing you might be wondering is, if I plant small potatoes, aren't I going to get small potatoes? Well, if this were sexual reproduction that we're talking about, that's absolutely correct. I would be worried about the genetics of these potatoes. But when we grow potatoes from potatoes, we're cloning. So if I were growing potatoes from seed, I would have, some concerns about the parents and the genetics of my potatoes if the parents had potatoes this small. But since these are clones, they're genetically identical to their parents, it doesn't matter. You don't have to save your biggest potatoes for your seed potatoes. That's not going to be a factor that impacts the size of your next year's crops. These are Yukon Gold potatoes from Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds. As you can see, I have this whole bed ready to go. This is just going to be a potato bed. I might plant some other stuff with shallower roots, interplanting, maybe throw some marigolds around it or something, but this is mostly going to be all about potatoes, which is a lot of fun. I've never grown this many potatoes. In fact, previously I've grown them in containers. Potatoes are really great for growing in containers because you can just tip your container and you don't have to worry about gouging your crops with your pitchfork. So consider that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to see what my spacing looks like, because I have quite a few here. And my goal is going to be to put these about a foot from each other, just to see how it all works out. Now you might have noticed that these potatoes are sprouting. It's generally considered good practice to pre-sprout your potatoes before you plant them. And it's called chitting. So that's a fun name. Okay, 17 seed potatoes going in this bed. That's probably going to be a little bit crowded. If you crowd your potatoes, what's going to happen is you can get more smaller potatoes. It doesn't necessarily, up to a certain density, negatively impact your harvest. So you could actually get slightly more potatoes by crowding them up to a point. So don't worry about that. Another thing to consider is the depth of planting. If you're planting your potatoes early, or if you're planting them in really dry soil, you're going to want to go deeper, like maybe 6 inches. Shallower planting will get me to potatoes above ground sooner. And since I am going in late in the season, I'm going to go about 2 or 3 inches down. So I'm going to reduce my planting depth. And this should help the potatoes come up just a little bit faster. And you'll notice this is nice and soft. Just a word, I did not pay to fill my whole bed with professional raised bed soil because I'm cheaper than that. What you see going on here is that I have filled my bed with native soil, heavily amended with organic material like grass clippings and stuff. And then just for the last 2 or 3 inches, so about as deep as I'm planting these potatoes, that's where I put on raised bed soil mix, just so that I'd have something on top. Usually, I wouldn't even use it for that top layer. Usually the top layer would be compost, but I like to buy compost from municipal dumps where I live, because that's just makes me part of the closed circle of using things, and I feel good about that. But the dump was out of compost this year, and so I'm going with the raised bed soil from the big box store instead. And I just went with the cheapest stuff, and this year that happened to be the organic mix, which kind of surprised me because usually when something has organic on the label, you can expect to pay a premium price. Now that I've got potatoes in the ground, I'm going to water them in. If you're watering well, you're going to want to keep going until you see the water start to flow off the top. And then usually once I see that level of saturation, I'm going to move on and water somewhere else. And then after after giving it a couple minutes, I'm going to come back and hit that area again until I see the water coming off it and not soaking in as readily again. So what that does is it gets my surface moist, and then it provides plenty of water to go down and moisten deeper in the soil as well, which is gonna really help with consistent watering, especially if you have trouble with tomatoes cracking or cat facing. Watering deeply is really gonna help with that, because then they're not gonna get a watering feast or famine. So now that I've got my potatoes in, let's talk about fertilizer. If you were gonna fertilize your potatoes, and you might have noticed that I conspicuously did not, what I would recommend is you're gonna want to, I just sat on a shovel. We're gonna leave that in. You're gonna want to make sure you use either a balanced fertilizer, or you're gonna want to use a fertilizer with a last number that's slightly higher than the first two numbers. Because your numbers go NPK. N is nitrogen, P is phosphorus, and K is potassium. And I know potassium sounds like it should start with a P as well, but chemists say K, and we're going with that, K. For root crops, you're gonna want higher potassium, so you're gonna want either a balanced fertilizer, so 10-10-10 or 3-3-3, or maybe 2-2-3, because if you encourage too much leaf growth with nitrogen, you need those leaves to capture sunlight and do their photosynthesis and make sugars and starches to go down and build potatoes with. But if you have too much nitrogen, the potato is just going to go nuts and shoot all its energy into making more leaves. So balanced fertilizer for that reason. Once your potatoes have reached a height of about 6 to 8 inches, then you may consider mounding your potatoes. That is actually optional. You don't have to mound your potatoes if you don't want to. There is a benefit to mounding your potatoes. Whether or not it increases your yield is, I think, up for a little bit of debate. But what it can do is it can protect any tubers that erupt from the ground from being exposed to the sun. And when your potatoes are exposed to the sun, you get the green potatoes, and they're going to develop that unpleasant flavor. Now, unless you eat a ton of green potatoes, the only problem with green potatoes is the flavor. But that unpleasant flavor is there for a reason. That is our body warning us that we are eating poison. Potatoes, being members of the nightshade family, will produce poison, and that poison will get into the tissue of your tubers if they're exposed to the sun. They'll start producing it there as well, because that poison is there as a pesticide to keep your potato from getting eaten. So that's pretty cool, and that's why really the only big issue with growing potatoes is blight, is because it makes its own pesticide. At 6 to 8 inches, you can mound it a little bit. You can use plant material like grass clippings if you want. You can use leaves from last fall if you've got some, or you can just use soil. It doesn't really matter. The softer the material you mound with, the more easily you can get to your potatoes should you choose to mound. I might not mound these. We'll see. I tend to just adapt to whatever the potatoes are doing because I'm a weirdo. So anyway, that is everything about potatoes, and I'm just going to take you around the garden now. If you're interested, hang around and I'll just show you what else is going on and talk about why. And if you were just here for the potatoes, thanks for being here. See ya. Let's start with the pepper bed, because there are a couple of interesting things going on here. Now, interesting thing number one is, look how tiny my pepper plants are. They've been growing for a month and they're tiny. And do you see my basil? It's tiny for basil. What is going on here? Well, they are stunted because the nighttime temperatures here in Logan, Utah are absolutely bizarre. It's been still dipping down into the 40s sometimes. And it's the end of June. Pepper plants like it hot, and I'm just not able to give them that right now. You'll notice I do have a jalapeno popping out right there. That's exciting. I do need to pick some basil to keep that growing nice and bushy. I've got flowers on my red bell and serrano plants, even though they are tiny. So I mean, there is growth happening. I'm not an emotional wreck about it, but I would love it if I did have bigger pepper plants. Now over here, this hole is interesting, and I'll tell you why. For the longest time, when I was a brand new gardener, I thought that holes like this were caused by cats and dogs and things digging in my garden. And it wasn't until much later that I learned this is probably a robin hole. Robins will have a frustrating habit of digging in soil to find food insects. And I've actually seen a robin, I've watched it with my own eyes, dig a hole as deep as his whole body and twice as wide, just looking for tasty critters. So I think these holes are from robins. Well, this hole is from in my earwig video. I dug a hole for an earwig trap. That's this hole. Robins didn't do this. You can see here in this bed, my basil is stunted as well. But surprisingly, my tomatoes are most decidedly not stunted. This Hungarian heart tomato plant is it's looking about 3 feet tall. And you can see I have fruit in progress. This is slower to set fruit and slower to produce harvestable fruit, but once we get going, it's amazing. Here on my raspberry liana, you can see I've almost got harvestable fruit. Probably by the middle of July, I'll be picking these and enjoying garden fresh tomatoes. I'm so excited. My pink bumblebee cherry tomatoes are busily producing tasty tomato fruits. I love how well these plants are shading their tomatoes. That's gonna help with the fruit quality. They're doing a really good job there. Notice that I have picked off the lower leaves for the most part. These are still probably hanging down a little lower than they should, so I might pull those off as well. By removing the lower leaves, you're reducing how much stuff can splash up on them and carry diseases to your plant. I'll usually, with cherries, just stop after I get a foot up, and generally all the plants. I am doing a double leader stake growing method here, so they're going to grow up these little stakes up into the sky, and I'm just, see, this one is forked here. I'm just letting both forks continue, but I'm going in and pulling off all of the other suckers on this. And if you're growing cherry tomatoes in a cage, don't remove your suckers. Things are just going to get crazy, and roll with it, have fun. But since I am growing up a stake, I am with a double leader, so that means 2 main vines, I'm removing some suckers. I'm also going to be doing that on my other plants that are staked as well. So let's see if I can find another sucker here for you, because there's always somebody who's confused about what is a sucker. So here's the leaf coming off, right? And then here's the stem going up, and then right here in what would be the armpit if tomatoes were humans is a whole new vine starting up. So this is what we call a sucker. I'm just going to pick that off. Again, if you're growing in a cage, you might not necessarily want to remove suckers. It is optional. If you have a plan that requires pulling suckers off, do it. But if you're just doing it because everyone talks about doing it, maybe don't. Maybe you don't have to. And finally, let's look over at this bed. This bed is not a success story at all by any stretch of the imagination. This is field bindweed. That's all I'm growing in this bed. Field bindweed has a really awful habit of just holding my other plants hostage. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to hit these with an herbicide. So you can tell me in the comments how awful I am for using an herbicide if you want to, but this is field bindweed, and unless you want to have it for years and years and years and fight it endlessly, that's pretty much all you can do. Hey, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me in my garden today and letting me share with you what's going on and how I like to plant potatoes. I hope you had a wonderful time, and I hope you have an amazing time in your own garden.